Something special is found in the black mica specks in granite rock. We've gone over this a little bit so far, but these black granite specks in the granite rock is something that we've said thus far already holds a mystery, a real mystery, of course, that is going to affect a lot of people before it's all over. We were talking about that thus far. And this evidence that we have discussed thus far is in the microscope, seen under the microscope in these black mica specks there in the granite rock. And David, again, we want to make sure we're all on the same page. What is that?
It's a polonium-218 halo. So we have a 3-ring halo, polonium-218 halo, an isotope of, it has a 3-minute half-life. And the idea is very simple. Like we said last night, if you have a molten rock and you have a theory of granite formation where that rock cools slowly over millions of years, you cannot have that theory and primordial polonium halos. It's that simple. Why? Because if you have primordial polonium halos implanted, the radio centers from that primordial polonium implanted in the rock at the time the rock formed from a melt, by the time the rock cools and crystallizes millions of years later, you've gone way past the 3 minutes or so that the half-life of polonium-18 exists, and you have no record of that halo left in the rock. So the only conclusion you can come up to, if that doesn't work, is to say that that is not primordial polonium, that must be polonium derived from uranium, the uranium decay series. So that is the method, or that is the strategy that most people that do not agree with the polonium halos utilize in their arguments to say that this does not make any sense. They say, well, it must have a secondary source. It has to, because if it doesn't, my whole theory of the age of the earth or the earth formation or granite formation all goes down the drain.
David, you know, we've talked a lot about primordial. That means made in the beginning, doesn't it? That's what primordial means.
Made in the beginning.
Made in the beginning. And so what we're talking about is something that had to be made in the beginning. Let's continue. Remember we had this schematic last night where we're talking about something that had a little speck of radioactivity there in the center, and it ejects particles, just microscopic distances in a piece of mica. And as a result of that, just like sun's rays, of course, will bleach objects, colored objects, the radiation from the little tiny speck there will discolor the region around that little tiny speck and produces then a halo. You can see it's three-dimensional. The little particles go out in all directions. But the particles themselves shooting out from that center, 3 different kinds of particles, originate with a kind of radioactivity that exists for only a short period of time. And that short period of time is associated with primordial radioactivity. And as we sort of review of basically what we've come up to make sure we're all on the same page, we have a whole series of these polonium halos. Polonium, of course, is simply a chemical element, but it's radioactive. But it has only a short half-life. It exists for only a short period of time, and then it's gone. And we had this summary slide last night, and David, tell us about the top and then about the bottom of that schematic that we have there to make sure we're all on the same page.
Right, this slide basically just reiterates what we've already said. The top half reiterates what the evolutionary model would predict. If you have slowly cooling granite over long periods of time, you would not have radio halos because the activity would have decayed long before the record could be left in the rock. If you do have a model of creation where God places the polonium in the rocks, creates the rock with polonium in situ, polonium there already, so that it's leaving a record immediately after the rock has been created, then you have a model which at least fits what we see in the field, what we see under the microscope.
It's important that we understand that what we're dealing with here is something observational. It's not theory. We're seeing these halos in granites all over the world. Primordial polonium halos conflict with what geologists believe about the origin of granite. But we will now see they themselves are barely confused about what they believe. In other words, geologists themselves have said granite forms slowly deep in the earth over a long, long period of time. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I mentioned earlier last night that if you take a geology class, you will learn very quickly that the textbook has a very definite definition of how granite forms. But if you look into it a little bit deeper, you actually see that geologists themselves have varying opinions on how granite forms. And for the reasons why is because you do not see active granite formation. In fact, back in 1947, there was actually a conference that was focusing on the origin of granite. How did granite form? And in this conference...
I just want to add to what you're saying here. We think it would be well for the viewers, audience, to know that indeed, of all things, geologists have been thinking about the origin of granite in the 1800s. They had seen all these granite rocks like El Capitan and others around the world, but they didn't know where the granite came from. Whereas, you know, if you have a volcanic eruption, it erupts and you see the rocks form, that's visual. You know where those rocks came from. But the geologists could not find a place where granite was forming. Isn't that true?
That's right.
They couldn't find that. So they had all these granite rocks all over the world, but they didn't know where they came from. So they had to invent. That's really the word they did. They invented the idea that the granites must have formed, isn't it true, out of sight.
Right.
And so out of sight, they figured, well, at one time it was hot down in the earth, well, really, really, really hot. We know it is hot down there further on. But there was a huge melt, and gradually over a period of time, it what? Cooled and went to a solid. Now, though, David, we're going to find out how well do they really know what they were talking about. You were going ahead.
Let's look at the next slide here. This is actually a quote from F. Fitz Osborne, I think is what the next slide is going to say. But anyway, in this quote, he says, "Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to take a part in a discussion of this sort for two reasons. In the first place, the newspapers and the radio are bringing problems before us every day, and they are threatening dire consequences if we do not solve them. In this symposium, we are treating a problem that is really an old friend. This problem goes back through almost all the years during which there has been a science of geology. We have never satisfied ourselves as to the solution, and we furthermore must note that no very serious consequences arise if we do not arrive at that solution." F. Fitz Osborne. What is that problem that is really an old friend? The problem is, how did granite form? And I mentioned briefly last night, there's another quote, we can go ahead and look at that too, that we're saying, you know, if granite formed naturally, you should be able to form it in the laboratory today. Well, people say, well, wait a minute. We're theorizing that granite forms slowly over millions of years. How could we ever devise a laboratory experiment that would last millions of years for the granite to slowly cool? And I'll give you a chance to think about that a little bit more. We'll talk about it when we show a slide later that actually shows a result from an experiment where granite was attempted to be synthesized in the laboratory. A.E.J. Engel, U.S. Geological Survey, said this: "The appeal has been made repeatedly for an objective approach to the problem of origin of granite." The problem is the origin of granite, with careful and restrained use of the attractive hypotheses. But they're not susceptible to proof. Why are they not susceptible to proof? Because you can't actually see the granite forming. It's miles underneath the Earth's surface. If exposed to continued testing, that's an important point in science. You have to test your views. Our points of view, like whiskey, will doubtless change and improve with age.
David,
that's the hope.
David, we want to remind ourselves and everyone, of course, this was an origin of granite symposium, I believe, held in 1947. And geologists have been thinking about the origin of granite for 150 years. But here in 1947, they were saying these things to one another. They're basically admitting, not realizing that later on we were going to find what they say and bring it out here tonight, how uncertain they were at that time. Have things changed at all? 1947. A lot of things have happened in the last 50 or more years. Let's see what else is going to happen. Well, now, there's another one here, says it was taking place in 1988. What happened?
Right. So a little more recently than 1947, 1988, there was another conference on the origin of granite. And a quote here by Professor W.S. Fife from the University of Western Ontario says, as was well documented by the discussion during this meeting, many, old questions are still debated. But I think we now have the tools to resolve many of the basic questions. I would certainly hope that 100 years hence, we will not be debating the origins of granite. The thing we're really trying to stress here and get across that we're coming up here and proposing a very radical idea. And that idea is that granite rock was part of the original created rock. You know, from a scientific point of view, that doesn't make any sense. You don't make scientific hypotheses based on something being created by God. That's something that's out of the realm of science. That's something that's in the realm of religion. But just hold on for a minute. Look at what the scientists say themselves about the origin of granite. They don't even know how really it formed. It's a mystery. And in fact, when you actually do the experiment to test whether the theory of granite formation actually works in the laboratory, it comes up far short of a granite. You actually come up with a rock that's called a rhyolite. But we'll look at that when we get to it. But go ahead and
David,
keep going here. And
we're talking about some exciting things. We're talking about something that basically overthrows a major discipline of science, of geology, that thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of geologists have believed, and millions of scientists in the world still believe it. And we're standing up here tonight and saying, indeed, fellas, you've got it all wrong. Look at that last sentence there. This man, Professor W. Fife, the last statement says, I would certainly hope that 100 years hence we will not be debating the origin of granite. Does that sound like to you that he's really got a realistic expectation that they're going to be able to explain
Yeah, I don't
it?
think so.
Can you imagine if the people in the world really understood, if even the science students, geologists going through the curriculum, really understood the tremendous uncertainties of what they learn in the classroom about the origin of granite, the origin of the earth, and going along with that, the age of the earth, and not only the age of the earth, the age of the cosmos. We're dealing with material here tonight, with ideas, with scientific data and the Bible, that literally, if understood, and that's why we're here tonight, to help people understand and get it out to the world, this is going to revolutionize. I'm not ashamed to say that in God's great providence it is going to happen, and there's going to be a revolution of some sorts. So we better be prepared. Anyway, that was back in 1988 where that symposium was occurring. But you know, the geologists didn't stop trying to explain granites at that time. Guess what happened?
Let me have that clicker.
Anyway, I'm getting carried away, aren't I? That's okay. Several years later, in the 90s, there was another symposium. Really, really thick. Thousands of experiments are being done. And again, Fourth Hutton Symposium on the origin of granite. No granite forming. Thousands of pages again. Then we got another one here, the early 2000s. Fifth Hutton Symposium on the origin of granite and related rocks. Still, thousands of geologists are working night and day for years and decades, now a century or more. And still no origin.
But I think it's important to say that when you go to the classroom and to even the college classroom, the idea that there's any kind of argument or uncertainty about the theory of how granite forms is not really conveyed in the textbooks. So the students really aren't getting any of the full picture of, saying, well, hey, there are, a lot of uncertainties about what we really believe here. And honestly, I think that's the same thing that's holding true for not just the theory of granite formation, but for the other classes that are being taught. Classes on the evolution, the different types of beliefs in evolution. Why do people believe in evolution? All of the uncertainties that are inherent in those theories aren't being fully disclosed to the students. It's being taught more as a fact. And behind all of these theories, of course, are serious flaws. And of course, behind our hypothesis, behind our belief is, of course, a belief that God is actually doing miraculous, he's doing miracles. So even that involves faith. But no matter whether you believe our conclusion about how the polonium halos exist, even if you don't accept our conclusion that they were created by God or they are evidence that God created the rock, you're still left with trying to explain them naturalistically. And that's the key to the whole situation. Even if you don't accept the conclusion of the polonium halos, you have to explain them naturalistically in your own model. And that's really what the problem is.
You know, I'm tempted to go ahead. I'll say something just about on what you said just then, and that is the students who go into the classrooms and they listen. They're listening to people they think do what? Know the truth. And so they absorb what they hear as if it is the truth. Peer pressure.
Well, you're programmed when you go to school to believe that whatever's told from you from the up front is a fact. And 99% of the time, that's true. You go to elementary school, you hear about math, you hear about all the, history, all these things that are, verified, or you can attempt to verify them. Math is a logical thing. So you're used to hearing truth from a teacher. It's all turned around backwards when the teacher's actually trying to tell you something which has not been verified, but they don't disclose to the students that it hasn't been verified. They present it as fact. And that's the thing that is really dangerous, especially the younger the students are, the less they're able to make up their own minds about what they believe, the more danger it is.
David, we've got what the geologists really calculate. In other words, we mentioned, of course, deep in the ground and so forth. They believe that the millions of years it took, of course, for the melt to become solid and so forth. But that means also there was what we call differential melting from the outside in. And so a small piece of melt then should be able to be solidified.
Right. So the argument that says, well, you can't devise an experiment to actually test the theory of formation of granite because you don't have the millions of years. But if you use the principle of differential cooling, you actually do have time to do that type of an experiment. In fact, it only takes a few days or a few weeks at the most. This theory of rapid cooling and formation of a small quantity of granite melt was disproved during the University of Tennessee public presentation on April 13, 1987.
Here we come to what I think is an exciting part of our presentation. Years ago, 1987, as David was saying, April 13, 1987, yours truly was invited to make a presentation on this topic at the University of Tennessee. And here's a view, at least of the audience that particular evening. A lot of people from the Knoxville area came, as well as students, as well as faculty members. And here's the title, Should Creation Science Be Taught at the University of Tennessee? Well, that grabbed some headlines there at the university and got some faculty members all excited about coming in and defending, of course, the university from the teaching of creation science. And it was Monday, April 13, 1987, the UT Alumni Gym, sponsored by the UT chapter of the Society for Creation Science, a chapter that I did not know anything about before they contacted me and asked me if I would make the presentation. I was the guest speaker that night, and there I am speaking. A little bit younger than I am tonight. But in any event, what I was saying at that particular time was what David and I have just been talking about. David can affirm, we've got a videotape of this, it'll be available tomorrow night for anyone who wants it. But David can affirm that indeed I was up there telling the audience, that here I've just got a small piece of granite. Supposedly this would form relatively soon if you tried to duplicate it. And so at that particular time we had a little piece of granite like this I had in my hand, and I was telling the audience, the thing that's wrong with evolution theory of granite formation is that you can't even duplicate something like this in the laboratory. And I said, that proves in itself the whole idea of granite formation is wrong, doesn't come out to be granite at all. And then I next remarked that to produce polonium halos in granite, in other words, if you're going to try to explain these primordial polonium halos naturalistically, that means you've got to be able to duplicate them in the granite rock itself. I was telling them about that. Then I said, the very fact, though, that geologists, no one can actually synthesize a small piece of granite. In other words, if you melt it and then let it cool under pressure and temperature and conditions and so forth, that it doesn't really come back to that. That was what I was saying to the audience at that particular time. And at that particular time, I had, as I said, a piece of granite in my hand, and this geology professor speaks out from the audience, said, "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about." And at that point in time, he had a number of geology students there. Do you remember what happened?
They were cheering.
Yeah.
And so when he got up, and when the professor stood up in the back of the audience, and he said, "I'm going to take exception to this," and he comes down, and his students were back there clapping and cheering, and, there was a real air of victory that was about to happen, because the professor of geology was going to come up and say, basically he stood up there and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about when you say you can't synthesize a piece of granite. I do it all the time in my laboratory. I do it, I can do, it happens all the time." But then when he was questioned a little more closely about it, and just for your own FYI here, the full videotape of his talk or his discourse there, or the whole presentation is available still. Unfortunately, the video quality isn't as good as it could have been, but you can still get an idea of the tension that was there that night, because at first, everybody's like really surprised that somebody stood up and challenged, but then, by the time, he stood up and was making these comments, it was apparent that he really believed in what he was saying.
It was a real first-class confrontation. He was right back there, about the end of the auditorium here, and I couldn't hear him. And I said, "Well, come on up to the microphone." And that's what he's done. He's come up to the microphone there. And he said, "What do you mean you can't synthesize granite? What do you mean? There are hundreds of reports in the literature. You're just ignorant. You're ignorant of all these reports. Where have you been?" Type stuff. And so I said, "Well, let me hear what you have to say." And so the more he talked, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you think you can synthesize a piece of granite?" "Yeah." I said, "How long will it take you?" Well, and I had a piece of granite, a small piece of granite in my hand. I said, "Well, come, take a look at this piece." And I walked over to the edge of the stage, and I said, "Come, take a look at it." And so he walked over and looked at it for half a minute or so and gave it back to me. And I said, "How long do you think it will take you to do that?" "About a week." "About a week." David smiling. He heard him say it. And so I said, "Can we all come back and see it? Can we all come back and see it in a week?"
And he said, no. He goes, my laboratory's not set up to do that. He goes, "But we can go down to Johnson Space Center," or where else did he say? Anyway, it doesn't matter what he said. You can look at the video, but one of them was Johnson Space Center. I just remember that for some reason. And I just thought, why would you go to Johnson Space Center? But anyway, it was good. It was a good illustration of the prevailing scientific belief that, there is really no controversy about the granite formation, and that you really can synthesize a hand-sized piece of granite. But when you really look into the details, it's a lot harder, it's a lot easier said than done. You can't really synthesize the granite. And the implications of that are important.
Well, as we continued, my interchange with the professor here went on for 23 minutes all in all, and again, it's all on the videotape. It's available tomorrow night if you're interested. It's online at www.halos. You don't have to buy anything, and it's all there. But as I progressed in discussing this with him. He continued to be affirming that hundreds of reports were in the literature, and I was just ignorant for not knowing about how many times granite had been synthesized, plus the fact that he continued to affirm that indeed he could do it. And so anyway, the issue was joined, so to speak. And finally, I said, I said, if you can do it, I'll give you my telephone number and I'll ask you to call me. And I said, we'll make this not only a citywide, county-wide announcement, we'll make it statewide. We'll make it national television that you, Professor Taylor, have been able to actually synthesize a piece of granite here at the University of Tennessee. Now, at this particular point in time, the applause of the students had gone down a little bit. But I mean, as David said earlier, they were a cheering section. They had planned it, apparently, for him to say something. It was a cheering section for a while. Anyway, the program ended that night. Before that particular program that night, earlier we said, last night, of course, that the National Academy of Sciences, this most eminent of all scientific organizations in the world, had put out a booklet in 1984, and they had said that essentially Genesis had been what?
Invalidated.
Invalidated. There was nothing to Genesis. And so I wrote a letter to the president of the National Academy of Sciences before our meeting that night and asking him to come and send members of the National Academy of Sciences and show where this evidence was going to be refuted, because it had all been published in the national journals. Anyway, he didn't come, but he wrote a letter, and that letter is a copy of that letter is in the back of my book, if you want to look at it that way. It's all online, halos.com. But anyway, the president, Dr. Frank Press, said, we recognize essentially that you have scientific reports, and these need to be discussed. But in essence, I'm not going to come. I'm not going to send anybody to be with you. We can't agree that one small piece of data, small piece of data, is going to overthrow all the fields of geology, astronomy, biology. It just went on and on and on. And as you have pointed out last night, earlier, that indeed this one little tiny piece of data, though, is what? Worldwide. And it's something where indeed the geologists, the evolutionists of the world, simply want to ignore. They want to bury. Usually when you find something unusual that contrasts or contradicts a known physical theory, scientific theory of any report, the scientists of the world would bring that to the center of scientific attention for analysis, for investigation, to find out what the truth is. But David, what has happened in this case?
Well, we're still going to find out.
We're still going to find. Thus far, they're trying to bury it. Well, anyway, he said he could make granite in a week. Nothing happened. In a week, nothing. 6 months later, nothing happened. I wrote to the geology department chairman, and I said, Dr. Taylor has said he promised he would give me a piece of granite in a week, or at least would provide me with one of these hundreds of reports on granite synthesis, but there was no reply. 22 years and more now tonight, there's still no granite synthesis. And so after he spoke, after that 23-minute exchange, I said, well, listen, there's something really important. I'm so happy you came forward tonight, because here's the situation. Geologists have claimed that indeed they have synthesized granite in the laboratory. That was a claim. Someone had indicated that to me many, many times. And so I investigated that claim. It was something that was done at the University of Pennsylvania way back in the 1960s, and a geologist there had actually taken a small piece of granite and put it in a platinum envelope and sealed it up, heated it up to 900 degrees centigrade, and then let it cool very, very, very slowly over several weeks. Now, those are the exact conditions you expect to have granite form experimentally. Well, it turns out that he had all that photographed. In other words, there was a motion picture made of this experiment in University of Pennsylvania way back in the 1960s. And then there was a time where indeed the experiment was over, and the platinum envelope was opened, and the piece of rock came out. Now, I, through God's great providence, was able to track down that particular piece of rock. Decades earlier, the geologists who had done it, by my request, went back, and my belief is that the Lord helped him to find that piece of rock, and he sent it to me. Well, I had it that night at the University of Tennessee, and I contrasted. Here's what happens in the earth. There's a granite melt in the earth, and sometimes it will protrude to the surface in a tube. And so a core then was taken of a granite melt that had solidified 1,683 feet below the surface, and indeed it was taken out. The core sample was there, and granite melted deep in the earth solidifies to rhyolite. Now that rhyolite has the same chemical elements as the original granite, but it does not have the texture, in other words, the large minerals. And it doesn't have the halos. This is what resulted from the actual experiment to try to synthesize granite. That's a fine-grained rock, just like the rhyolite that we just saw. There's no difference. There it is. And so I showed the whole audience that night. I said, this is the answer to what we're talking about tonight. Granite does not reform as a result of the cooling of a melt over a long period of time under pressure and so forth. I said, here is the original granite, and here is what comes out of the experiment. There's no resemblance. And remember this, that in the original granite, there are these primordial polonium halos. Guess what happens when granite is melted? Granite is melted and resolidifies like this, or like this piece of rhyolite. There are no halos whatsoever. The work of creation is gone completely. So 22 years down the road now, no one has responded. Not only that, but I spoke at the University of Tennessee, again, just a year and a half ago, and I advertised a full-page ad in the Knoxville News Sentinel indicating I was going to be speaking at the University of Tennessee again, and I invited everybody in the city of Knoxville, Tennessee to come, and also I put ads in the Daily Beacon, the student newspaper of the University of Tennessee, to especially inform the students and all the faculty I was going to be there again, so that if they wanted to start the warfare all over again, or the controversy, or if they had the answer, there they were going to have their opportunity. April 9 last year, guess what? I went and I spoke again. How many faculty members were there this time? None. How many students were there as a cheering section? There was one lone student sitting over there in the distance. He didn't say anything. What I'm saying is this is far, far down the road of the God of heaven helping us all to understand. We're dealing with experimental facts that affirm the Genesis record of creation, what God said. So, we'll continue. What I'm saying tonight is also in the book Creation, Tiny Mystery. It's all online if you'd like to read it, halos.com. So we see why the evolutionary theory of an Earth slowly cooled from a hot molten ball over billions of years has never been a valid scientific theory. Best can be compared to the Ptolemaic cosmology debacle. Remember, Ptolemy had the idea that indeed the planets were circling what? The Earth, and the sun was circling the Earth. It was that bad, and it's that bad even today. Nevertheless, the crucial question is, what is the response of the worldwide scientific community been to the primordial polonium halo evidence for creation? And in the decade before the trial in Arkansas, I was a visiting scientist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and was able to publish a number of scientific papers about this, what we're talking about tonight, in the world's leading scientific journals. David, you want to help us review this?
Yeah, somebody last night was talking to me and saying, exactly what was said in the scientific reports. And I said, well, we'll be bringing out quotations from those. But the stories behind the publication of these reports are actually more interesting, just as interesting as the evidence themselves, because it really focuses your attention on the fact that each published report has a miracle story behind how it got published. In fact, some of the wording from the reports still was able to contain enough information to raise eyebrows. For instance, in Nature, the 1973 report, the phrase that was taken from this report says the half-lives of the polonium isotopes, approximately 3 minutes for polonium-218, are too short to permit anything but a rapid mineral crystallization contrary to accepted theories of magmatic cooling rates. So, in scientific lingo, that's saying, what's accepted is over here, but this is what we have. It's contrary to that. There's some more quotations here, I think.
I want to focus on this just a second. Nature, of course, the editor of Nature magazine at that time and still today, they're evolutionists, strong evolutionists. Not only that, but these papers that I've sent in for publication, they went out to strong evolutionists for review. They had to be peer-reviewed before they were okayed for publication. And this statement that I put in there is, David said, in scientific lingo, that means that indeed we're talking about too short to permit anything but a rapid crystallization. The scientists who read that understood that what we were saying is that the granite rocks had to cool rapidly. Now, they would not and I may get into have the opportunity here after a while of telling you just a little bit about God's great providence and interacting with some of the editors and the scientists themselves about these results. It's fascinating. As David has said, God's hand was behind the scene all the time that was sending these papers in for publication. But anyway,
tell them, just since you said that, you can just tell them one brief incident where the reviewer asked you, "What are you getting at here?" So you just have to briefly say tell them that one little story.
You dared to open the door for me to talk about this briefly?
I'll tell you what, I'll let you do that if you let me have that clicker.
Well, I believe, we ask for the Lord to lead and guide, and so I think David has asked a question that needs to be answered briefly. And when I was very early starting out, and sending these papers in for publication, I sent one in to the journal Science, their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the editor, was frowning at me because he saw that indeed what I was sending in for publication was contrary to what he thought was the truth, because he was a professional geologist as well as an associate editor of the magazine. But anyway, he sent my paper out for review, and it came back. The review came back, and normally a review of scientific papers will never have the reviewer's name on them. But this one did. The reviewer said, I want to talk to you. What in this world are you talking about? So I immediately called him up. And the first thing he said, told him who I was and so forth, he said, I know who you are. I want to know, what is it you're talking about in this paper? And I said, I'm going to be up front with you. I say, I think these polonium radio halos are evidence of fiat creation. Now, he could have hung up on me, slammed the phone, and said all sorts of negative things. But he said, my grandfather was a Methodist minister. But anyway, after that introduction, he said, what about this? What about this? What about this? More and more technical aspects of the paper. And I answered them. And I said, well, what can we do? I still want to get this paper published. And so he said, well, I tell you what, I want you to do this experiment, this experiment, this experiment, this experiment, and then, send the paper in for publication again, and I'll take another look at it. I did all of that. And then when I finished that, I called him. He was at Carnegie Mellon University. And I said, I finished, I've rewritten the paper and so forth, getting ready to send it in for publication. But before I do that, I want to let you take a look at it. So I flew up to Pittsburgh. He picked me up. This world-renowned evolutionist picked me up, took me to his office there at Carnegie Mellon University. We went over the paper, sentence by paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, word by word, and comma by comma, and period by period, the whole day. And at the end of the day, he said, there's something here I don't understand. But on the way back, he took me back to the airport that night, catch a plane back to Washington, D.C. He said, and I told him, again, we discussed God actually having these in the rocks to provide evidence of creation. But he said, oh, listen, Bob, I want to tell you, if you say anything about God doing this or God responsible for these halos, I'm going to slam the door. I won't have the paper published, just like that. So anyway, I went back, revised it a little bit again according to his other suggestions, sent it in for publication, and waited and waited and waited and waited and waited, and called, and the editor and said, the paper has not come in from this scientist there. And I got very well acquainted with this evolutionist editor there at Science Magazine, and he got to know me very well. We went out to eat together with my wife and a friend of ours there. Can you imagine that? Big-time evolutionist, associate editor of the paper, me, a creationist, believing the earth is 6,000 years old, but he sees the weight of the evidence as such. What is he going to do? He sends it out for review, and these people can't turn it over, can't turn it down, they can't overthrow it. And anyway, got to the point it was still waiting for his final review in order to get the paper published. It never came in. And finally, I called one day at the office after I'd been calling for months. I said, what's happened to my paper? And I asked for the editor, and they said, oh, the editor, he's in the hospital. My heart sank. I said, oh, no, this man's been trying to help me to get this paper published for a year, and now he's in the hospital. And I said, do you know where it is? They looked, and they said, we can't find it. I said, it's got to be there somewhere. And they said, well, wait a minute, we'll look one more place. He came back and said, I found it. I said, where is it? It's on the copy editor's desk. The copy editor's desk? Yeah, it's been approved for publication. It's going to be published here in just a few weeks. I can't go on, but anyway, I will go on. I will go on, because after I got the paper back and I had the final review copy and ready the printed copy ready to go in for publication, the editorial copy, I decided to take it back down to the editor and thank him for the fact that indeed he had done so much to help to get the paper published. Went down to see him, sat down and was talking to him there in his office there in Science in downtown Washington, D.C. And he said, Bob, you know, he got out of the hospital. He said, Bob, whatever happened to that paper we had in for publication? I said, John, you don't know. Here's the paper right here. I've got it. It's the copy-edited version. It's ready to be published. His face turned pale. He thought, what in the world have I done? Anyway, he said, let me have the paper. I went back home, Pat and I prayed earnestly that God would not let this man back out after all that. And he didn't. The paper was published. It's in the back of my book. Anyway, David, that's what you did in opening that door for me to say something. We could go on and on, but...
Well, I think it's important, you know, part of what we're trying to do is establish credibility for what we're saying. And I don't care who you talk to, where they're from, who they work for, where they went to school, it doesn't make any difference. Do they have published scientific reports refuting this evidence? And I can tell you right now, the answer is no, they don't. So they can complain and they can cry all they want about how they don't believe the polonium halos evidence, this or that. But ask them one simple question. What papers have you published to refute that evidence? And the answer is going to be very simple. None. And not only that, the papers that the magazines where these papers were originally published was not the Review and Herald. It wasn't, Ministry Magazine.
Signs of the Times.
Signs of the Times or whatever. It was, the world's premier scientific journals. So to try to take pot shots at the evidence for creation without backing it up with your own published work, to me is not sound. It doesn't make sense. So that's why I think it is important. And yes, when you do look at some of the stories behind how the papers originally got published, to me it only adds more credibility to the story which we're trying to build, and that is basically God really did leave something in the rocks as evidence of His creative power. And you can go to the Bible and you can read the Bible and you can see that what we're saying matches what you read in the Bible. There's no reason why it shouldn't match, because if God left the evidence for creation in the rocks, it's going to match what He has written in the Bible. That's our view of things.
Let's continue. This is what someone else said, again in Science in 1973, that indeed other people were looking at this evidence that I had been publishing, and it says, it was realized very early their existence, meaning the polonium halos, would cause apparently insuperable geological problems since the relevant polonium half-life is of the order of minutes. In other words, they recognize that indeed, if you have them there at all, then it's going to demand something being crystallized, or the granite's being crystallized very, very, very rapidly. Then, of course, here's another statement from my other paper there in Nature, David.
In this article in this publication in Nature, the phrase is added, do polonium halos imply that unknown processes were operative during the formative period of the Earth? Is it possible that polonium halos in Precambrian rocks represent extinct natural radioactivity, primordial, and are therefore of cosmological significance?
Now that cosmological significance, see what we were saying is this, whereas people, the geologists, astronomers, everyone in the scientific community believes that the Earth came from the remnants of the Big Bang. And so therefore they're saying that the matter of the Earth actually came from exploding stars billions and billions of years ago. So when I say they're cosmological significance, the polonium halos are cosmological significance, what we're saying is, in their language, that indeed we're saying that the matter that supposedly formed in a supernova got over here to the Earth and was cooled in solid form within just a few minutes. That's what it means. That's the essence of what that statement meant. That was the closest I could come to explain to them that we're talking about instant creation of matter, no matter where supposedly it originated. Not only that, but here we have, and now in science,
that polonium halos could have formed only if the host rocks underwent a rapid crystallization renders exceedingly difficult, in my estimation, the prospect of explaining these halos by physical laws as presently understood. In other words, they don't fit the current evolutionary model.
Not only that, don't fit, but here is something, it's demanding a new paradigm, a new explanation. And guess what's happened? Go ahead, another one.
It is also apparent that polonium halos do pose contradictions to currently held views of Earth history. Massive understatements, as you can see. I mean, these are understatements by a mile. But that's the most powerful, or that's the strongest language that these scientific journals would allow. They're not going to allow him to say, "And I believe God created the Earth," in 6 literal days.
It's interesting to see, at this particular point in time, I had been a guest scientist there at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory filled with people of all persuasions, atheists, agnostics, and whatever. And the management of the laboratory saw me taking these papers going in for publication, and they saw them being accepted, and they saw them being published, and they were wondering, what in the world is going to happen? This man is out there saying these things like this. This was not being done in a vacuum. This is one of the world's elite scientific journals. And they're wondering, they look at me, I was only going to be there supposedly for 1 year as a guest scientist, then the second year, then the third year, then the fourth year, and then the fifth year, and on. And this paper was going in and is saying things like that. That made things shake and rattle there a little bit at the laboratory. But they kept me on. Why? Because there was no one in the scientific community that was refuting any of this. Over and over again, the statements were being made stronger and stronger, and the evidence was growing and growing and growing, and I was still there. So, David, what was the reaction of the scientific community to these reports and conclusions? What was it?
This actually came from a publication that was reviewing the evidence for creation, and they basically made these points. Current physical laws may not have governed the past. Earth's primordial crustal rocks, rather than cooling and solidifying over millions of years, crystallized almost instantaneously. Some geological formations thought to be 100 million years old are in reality only several thousand years old.
Let me give a little background to this. There's a research communications network actually got busy. When they saw my papers coming out as they were, and they saw them being unchallenged, they took it upon themselves, without my knowledge, to send letters to some of the world's prominent scientists, Nobel laureates, in fact, asking them their opinion, their understanding, their comprehension of these papers that are appearing in the scientific journals. They got letters back from a number of these prominent scientists, including Nobel laureates, and they then published this sort of summary and sent it out everywhere about the radio halos and the implications. And this is what Dave is going to continue now. We're going to pick out one of the responses from those letters in this organization's magazine report.
Grant these propositions, and any researcher will tell you the entire structure of the historical natural sciences would dissolve into formlessness. Few certainties would remain. Yet these possibilities and others equally disintegrative have been published over the past several years in the world's foremost scientific journals, Nature, Science, Annual Review of Nuclear Science, among others. One of the reviewers that was actually one of the scientists that this Research Communications Network actually asked to comment on the polonium halo research said the following: Gentry's conclusions are startling and shake the foundations of radiochemistry and geochemistry. Yet he has been so meticulous in his experimental work, so restrained in his interpretations, that most people take his work seriously. I think most people believe, as I do, that some unspectacular explanation will eventually be found for the anomalous halos, and that orthodoxy will turn out to be right after all. Meanwhile, Gentry should be encouraged to keep rattling this skeleton in our closet for all it is worth. Professor Edward Anders from the University of Chicago.
One of the world's preeminent geochemists at that particular time. So here tonight we're still trying to rattle that skeleton, and there's more. Remember at the Arkansas creation trial, Dr. Dalrymple, the geologist, called the polonium halos a very tiny mystery. I think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. That's what Dalrymple said. Did he later say anything else about it? Yes, he did. In 1992 and 95, in fundraising letters that were sent out for the Pro-Evolution National Center for Science Education. Let me just give you a background before we get into that. I'm a member of the American Geophysical Union. These letters were sent to me because I'm a member of the AGU. But it was under the letterhead of the National Center, Pro-Evolution National Center for Science Education. Anyway, I saw it. I saw the letter that first came, and I thought, well, this is from the National Center of Science Education, Pro-Evolution. I'm not interested, so I was just going to throw it away. Fortunately, David and Pat rescued it, and they read it, and they showed it to me. And are we ever thankful?
Well, you just have to kind of take the, think about the setting here. You get junk mail in the mailbox all the time. And, how often do you really read junk mail? I mean, not too often. I mean, normally you just throw it away. But in this one case, I thought it would just kind of be funny to see what exactly the National Center for Science Education was trying to tell us. I thought this might be interesting, And it just so happens that in the process of reading this random letter that was sent as a fundraising letter, we happened to come along this very interesting phrase embedded in the letter. Basically, we'll start out by telling you what it says at the beginning. Dear fellow AGU member, I'm writing to tell you about the National Center for Science Education, an organization of scientists that defends what? Rational science education. That would be opposed to irrational science education, which would be, something that would include creation. Now, the problem, and this is a serious problem, is the fundamentalist opposition to evolution. I know it's hard to believe that evolution can still be a problem in 1992, the time the letter was written, but the opposition to evolution throughout the U.S. and Canada has actually increased during the last year. The movement, this is where it got interesting, the movement called scientific creationism is composed of biblical literalists who claim to have scientific evidence that the world was created all at one time, only a few thousand years ago. Some of our colleagues think that the scientific creationism movement can be ignored, but I think they're wrong. The movement is beginning to affect some college classes too, as members of Genesis clubs enter classrooms with disruptive and difficult to answer questions. How would you answer a student who announced in your class that the second law of thermodynamics doesn't permit evolution, or that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrates that granite had to have formed suddenly, i.e. was specially created? I don't know where he got the stories. I would have given really just about anything to have been in some of those classrooms where these random students might have said these things. And the expression on the teacher's face when they said it. Because in all probability, the college professor probably had never heard of polonium halos. And so when somebody says from the audience, yeah, but what about polonium halos? Doesn't that mean the earth was specially created? He was probably like, what are you talking about? Of course, when you actually look into it, it's actually true. So anybody in the class that actually looked into it, would have come back and said, yeah, that guy knew what he was talking about. There's actually stuff that says that. And so, all this actually got back to guess who? Brent Dalrymple. Brent Dalrymple is the one that wrote this letter. He, above anybody else, knows about the polonium halos. Why? Because he was at the Arkansas creation trial, and he is the one who knew very well the implications of what the polonium halos meant. And furthermore, he said, and I think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. 1981. Fast forward to 1992, still did not have an answer to that little mystery. Don't you think that if he had known or figured out by that time what the answer to that little mystery was, that he would have shared it with all the members of the American Geophysical Union? It makes sense. If there was some naturalistic, he could have said very easily, well, you know what? Here's the answer that you need to give to these students in your classrooms that talk about polonium halos. What you say is you say that the polonium is secondary, derived from uranium, and on and on and on and on. But he doesn't say any of that. He poses the question as a very thought-provoking question, saying, this is a problem. We have people announcing in classrooms saying polonium halos demonstrates granite was formed suddenly. And the second law of thermodynamics doesn't permit evolution. So I think It's interesting to note that the same person that in the trial, the Arkansas trial, said, this is something that can be solved, I want to know what the answer is, really doesn't have the answer years later. And in fact, that was 1992. Fast forward another 15 years.
No, 3 years, 1995.
Well, 1995, but I'm just saying in 1995 he rewrites the letter. You can see here in 1995 he writes the same letter. It's essentially the same thing, except he says, how would you answer a student who claims that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrates that granite had to inform suddenly, i.e. was specially created? In this particular letter, he leaves out the part that talks about the second law of thermodynamics. There's really no answer forthcoming. The answer really is not forthcoming because the true answer is that God left his fingerprints in the rocks to help establish faith in the inspired Word of God, the Bible, for those that are interested.
Let's focus on that as well as you have done there. The fact of the matter is, twice it went out to the 30,000 member American Geophysical Union. And there's a SOS, fellows, help me, help us all. You got students running around here and telling their teachers and everybody else, you got scientific evidence for creation. And that second one, David and I...
In fact, we might even need to form some Genesis clubs around here. So, I think that this might be something that would be useful in just about any college classroom that you can think of.
Yes, I would agree. But anyway, it would cause an uproar. It would cause an uproar if there was a Genesis.
But they're valid questions, so it's not something that, it's a valid question.
All right, let's continue. That was 1995. Brent Dalrymple wrote this huge book, The Age of the Earth, in 1991. Did he mention anything about this tiny mystery and the polonium halos at all? No. Then he wrote another book, 2004, Stanford University Press. Did he write anything about the polonium halos in that book? No. I was in touch with Brent Dalrymple over this period of time because in the year 2000, he edited an issue of the book of the magazine called GeoTimes, the monthly magazine of the American Geological Institute, just evolution. And so I called him. I've been friends with him. I told him, I said, Brent, if the day ever comes when you decide to be a Christian, call me. I want to help you. I'm on good terms with the man. But anyway, at that particular time, because this GeoTimes article was coming out, it had come out in 2000, December, I said, and the editor won't let me write anything. I said, Brent, help me. Get in touch with the publisher, Sam Adams. I want to write at least a little letter here in response to what you have said. And this man says, okay, I'll do that. And so in the March issue, 2001 issue of GeoTimes, I've got a letter in there. And that letter basically reiterates, let's see if I can get the pointer up here. Can't see it very well. Can't see it at all. Anyway, that letter refers to the letters that we just referred to that Brent Dalrymple on 2 occasions said, what are we going to do about this polonium halo for evidence for fiat creation? Quoting it. And now bringing it out within the magazine itself. GeoTimes goes to another 10, 20,000 geologists now. They see that indeed Brent Dalrymple has got an SOS, and this is a mystery that is unsolved, and they see clearly what the implications have to be because Brent Dalrymple himself is saying fiat creation, fiat creation, fiat creation. What are we going to do if we can't solve the problem? So, as we continue then, thousands of geologists saw the letter, no answer was forthcoming. So it's all over with the theory of a naturalistic origin of granite and an anciently evolving earth. That's where we continue. In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. Now, he spake and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. So, what scientific impact do polonium and uranium halos and the granites have on the age of the earth? David, that's what we want to take up now. In the age of the earth, the whole idea of the age of the earth being old is simply because geologists will go out and take rocks such as the granites and they'll measure the amount of uranium in the rock and then they'll measure the end product of the uranium decay, which is lead-206. And so they say, well, if we've got slow lead accumulation, that assumes the earth evolved from chaos over billions of years and the uranium decay rate was unaffected by any unusual events in Earth's history. In other words, they assume that indeed if uranium is decaying at the same rate that it is today, they've got a certain amount of lead and a certain amount of uranium, just like water dripping into a bucket, provided you don't turn the spigot up, They can use that as a clock. So this whole idea of the age of the Earth is dependent very critically on this whole idea of uranium and the other radioactive elements decaying very, very slowly at their current rate. But the question is the following. First of all, how do the polonium halos provide any evidence at all contrary or agreeing with that? Well, indeed, if you've got primordial polonium halos, as we've already said, then what happens to all these billions of years of granite formation evolving? What happens to it?
Collapses the time frame.
It collapses it to what? Almost nothing. You don't have any time for the ancient rocks to begin to cool and for the radioactivity to begin to decay very, 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 very slowly. As David has said earlier at the top schematic there, that's the usual uniformitarian way of looking at things. You've got radioactive decay, slowly cooling molten granite. But indeed, because you've got the primordial polonium in there, you wouldn't have any halos if it was slow cooling of the granite. Only way it's going to happen is for the granite to have been created instantly along with the radioactivity and the particles to shoot out rapidly to form the halos. So, now it turns out, David, if you want to go ahead and pick up.
You know, we've been talking a lot about polonium halos, but what about the uranium halos? We actually showed a picture of a uranium halo last night. They have a lot more rings than the polonium halos. There's more alpha decay steps from the uranium-238 to the daughter product lead-206. Evolutionists claim that they take hundreds of millions of years to develop these uranium halos. What they don't realize is that they are actually coloration thermometers that tell they could not have developed slowly under the assumption of a constant decay rate and hot conditions deep in the earth. Why is this? It's very simple. Remember, halos cannot form when the rock is molten. They not only cannot form when the rock is molten, they cannot form when the rock is even hot. So the rock has to be in a cooled state. So if you have a fully developed uranium halo, that in and itself is an impossible event, assuming a constant rate of radioactive decay of uranium, and several million year half-life, because you cannot propose that that rock has been sitting there with the uranium halo forming for millions of years, because the rock in its lifetime must have been heated to a very high temperature. Anytime that rock was heated to a very high temperature, what happens to the record of the halo? It's gone. So you have to have a uranium halo. You have to hypothesize, how did that uranium halo develop? In this case, it has a long half-life, which you would think, well, that fits the theory of evolution. That doesn't help creation, but it really doesn't make sense in an evolutionary framework either, for a different reason. The different reason being that if it was theorized to form deep underground in the hot environment of the molten magma, then the halo would have never formed just from the sake of temperature alone. Not from the standpoint of half-life, but from the standpoint of just the physical conditions necessary for halo formation.
Let's continue. Let's look at this schematic here one more time. Again, what we're saying is, miles in the earth, we've got this big blob of molten granite melt, and it's going to supposedly, this is now the usual evolutionary way of looking at things, of course. David has already mentioned that. After many thousands of years, it begins to cool from the outer periphery inward, cool, slowly. Then after many millions of years, 50 million years, 100 million years, you finally got, a pool of magma supposedly at the beginning over there on the left, finally cools. That is the way that supposedly El Capitan came into existence according to evolution. In fact, if you go over there, I'm told you'll see signs to that effect. It's hundreds of millions of years old or whatever, deep in the earth for a long, long period of time. And then the reason we see it as it is right now is because it was pushed up in recent geological history. Well, what David has got through telling us here is that here's the uranium halo. That supposedly took, according to evolutionary theory, it's one in my own collection, I see it and so forth, analyze it. It took about several hundred million years, 500 million years to form as a result of the slow uranium decay. But here's the situation, as David had just said, that indeed I've also analyzed granite cores taken from a deep drill hole in New Mexico, Fenton Hill. And you can see on the left-hand side the feet as the drill core went down. On the right-hand side, the temperature corresponding to the levels, the depth levels, so to speak. And you can easily see, of course, at 3,148 feet, the temperature has already gone up to 105 degrees centigrade. 7,115 feet, it's now at 115 degrees centigrade. 9,508 feet, 197 degrees centigrade. 12,885, 277 degrees centigrade. 14,131, 313 degrees centigrade. 3 times the boiling point of water. The interesting thing is, when I was examining these core samples, I extracted the zircons from them and looked at the thin sections of the granites under the microscope. Guess what I saw about the way in which the coloration of the halos looked? At the surface, they looked just like you saw in that last picture, the uranium halo. Very, very well developed. The coloration was full. But guess what was happening as we went down? Well, it didn't take long. At 3,148 feet, 105 degrees centigrade, the halos had begun to fade considerably. And by the time we get down to 7,115 feet, 115 degrees centigrade, virtually all gone. The annealing had taken place so rapidly at that point. There were no halos. So below that, 197 degrees, 277, 313 degrees, no halos. Now keep that in mind. Just down 7,000 feet or thereabouts in this particular point, the temperature 151 degrees, the halos were almost all annealed. What is going to happen then below that? Nothing. Could halos form even below that temperature? The answer is no, as you were saying. So what do we have? Go ahead, David. You've already said it. Maybe you just want to summarize it again.
Yeah, we've already said pretty much what's in this slide here.
They could only have formed in rocks that existed about the present temperature. In other words, instead, and the uranium halos could never have developed if all the granites had cooled slowly from a hot melt over eons of geologic time, because the higher temperatures existing deep in the crust would have erased them. Remember, the geological theory says 1,000 degrees, 900 degrees, 800 degrees, that's when supposedly the granites begin to form. 500 degrees. There's no way any coloration at all will develop, and yet that's exactly the way, supposedly, the geologists think that the uranium halos form. Deep in the earth, hot. No way. It would not have had any halos whatsoever. What we have here is a situation where the only way you can have those uranium halos in the here and now is that they developed at essentially the temperatures they are right now, and that the decay process took place more rapidly from some event, some unusual event in Earth's history. Now, we're going to continue here and say there's confirmation of what we're saying, very specific confirmation, again from material taken from the Fenton Hill drill site. Now we're going to look at this again. Here we have the different temperatures, as we have seen before. I took granite cores from each one of those slices, so to speak, and this time took the granite cores and separated out what we call the zircons. Zircons, zirconium silicates, and have a little bit of uranium, and so therefore, these are the zircons, microscopic zircons, taken under polarized light, and these form the basis then of the experiments we're going to tell you about right now. David, tell us a little about this. Is now a single zircon crystal, and our friend Russ Humphreys has got this diagram for us. Tell us what it's basically saying here.
Well, you have the whole nuclear decay process happening within the zircon, and with each successive nuclear decay, you have the alpha particles or the helium nuclei being emitted from the radio centers of the halos. So you have an accumulation of helium within the zircons. So what you can actually do is measure the retention of helium in each zircon and then determine what you would expect the helium retention to be on the basis of evolution, and compare that to what the data actually is when you go to each various level, and you can make a determination as to whether or not the data fits in anciently evolving Earth.
The next chart shows the temperature rises to over 3 times the bottom to the boiling point of water. We've already seen that at the bottom of the hole. What was of most interest as far as the age of the granite was concerned is the very high retention of helium in tiny radioactive zircons, even at the very high temperatures. Let's see if we can get an idea of basically the principle, the theory behind what we're going to be looking at. Suppose we had a picture of the Fenton Hill site here just a minute ago. Let me run back to that real quick like there. David, we're just going to make an imaginary experiment here. It's important for everyone to understand we're at the top of the drill here, and I've got a bucket of water full, and I let it down at the bottom of the drill hole, but I don't tell you how long I keep it down there. You come in after the day is finished and so forth. Initially, it was full of water, and when you see it, when it comes back up, I tell you it's 90% full. Now, would you say it's been there for 10 hours, 5 hours, 1 hour, or only about 10 minutes? What would you say? How long has it been down there? Let me do it again. Let me do it again.
No, let me try to say this another way. If you have the zircons containing this helium, and your model of the Earth is that the Earth is old, and you dig up these these zircons containing helium, and they still retain too much helium, too much for evolution to explain, what do you have? You have evidence for a young Earth. The reason why is because, just like he was saying, it's the same principle that if you were to lower a bucket of water in a deep hole, you'd have so much steam and so much heat that it would boil that water away very quickly. So if you were to lower a bucket of water down deep in the earth and pull it out and no water is left, well, obviously you've left it down there quite a while. But if you lower it down and you pull it out right away and there's still water there, then you know the water hasn't been down in that hole very long. That's the same exact thing that's happening with the helium zircons. The core samples were collected, the zircons were separated out, the helium was measured, and it turns out that the amount of helium that was measured in the zircons was too great to be explained on the basis of an ancient Earth. And so basically we have two lines of evidence. We have the line of evidence from the polonium halos, which shows that granite cooled rapidly, was formed rapidly. Then we have the evidence of a young age of the Earth from the retention of helium in the zircons. You wouldn't expect much retention of helium in the zircons because evolution says the Earth is old. And so in fact, most of these deeper depths, you shouldn't have any helium in the nuclei of these zircons or within these zircons. But in fact, you still see...
This particular chart right here simply says, you can see the dots above, the half circles there represents the helium in the zircons to begin with, and you can see the dots over there to the right.
More dots means that it's boiling away faster.
Now,
so the deeper you go, the faster the helium's boiling out of these zircons.
Now this chart actually shows what was found, that indeed the actual circles are all gone there and very, very deep, and then at 197 degrees centigrade, only a tiny bit left, and then of course closer to the surface you've got still quite a bit there. So differential retention of the helium was the result of, indeed, the zircons being at high temperatures, and it got to the point where the temperatures were enough so that, indeed, it's all gone later on. Now, that is basically the analysis. That's what the experiment showed. Now, on the left-hand side over here, what do you expect to find on the basis of a long age of the Earth, billions of years? Only a tiny bit of helium, even there at the very surface, at 3,148 feet. What we found is some helium all the way down almost to 277 degrees centigrade. So what that means is it could have only been down there. Those zircons at that temperature could only have been down there a relatively short period of time, and that was published. I published that in Geophysical Research Letters way back in 1982, right before I was asked to leave the Oak Ridge National Laboratory because I testified for creation at the Arkansas trial. Well, I didn't have time to do all that I wanted to do there, but I did get this paper published. Fortunately, the Institute of Creation Research decided a number of years ago, they called me and said, Bob, we think this is important. We want to try to duplicate the experiments. Tell us exactly what you did, and I did. They had a member of their staff that was associate professor of their staff, ICR, who was also a member of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, so he was able to get the same type of core samples that I'd gotten. They sent those core samples off and extracted the zircons. I told them what to do, a separate laboratory. Then they took those zircons and they had them mass analyzed just as I had done at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory way back in the late 70s, early 80s. And guess what? Their final calculation of the age of the Earth based on their new results agrees with the estimate in my paper. They arrive at a definite average value of about 5,680 years plus or minus 2,000 years, obviously very much in agreement with results obtained from biblical genealogical records from Adam to Christ. Here is the schematic now that shows basically, we don't have time to go into all the details. If you go to the ICR website and look at ICR and the helium retention, you'll be able to find all of this. So we'll go to the next one, and again, you can see the estimated age, the bottom figure down there, 5,680 years plus or minus 2,000 years. That's the diffusion age based on the experimental work. And let me tell you, the geologists have not touched this work. They haven't touched the primordial polonium halos. They haven't touched this work of finding the high retention of helium in these deep granite cores. So, here's another schematic it was made there by ICR. Basically, nuclear decay supposedly would be a billion and a half years for the zircons and radioactive decay there. But the very fact of the matter is, what we actually find in the rocks contradicts that on the right and suggests that indeed there was a rapid increase of radioactive decay producing a lot of helium in a short period of time, and that's the reason why we got the results that we did. So what this means is, remember earlier we said that indeed the radioactive dating methods depend upon what? The slow accumulation of uranium to its lead product. The other option is the rapid accumulation of lead resulting from different physical laws put in effect at the fall of Adam and Eve and the worldwide flood. Huge changes occurred, even at creation when sin entered the picture. Huge changes occurred, of course, at the fall of Adam and Eve. And indeed, remember, everyone was built to live forever, and right after the fall, everyone begins to die. The physical laws that govern this world were different after the entrance of sin than they were before. Something was happening, and let's put it this way. Today, there's a lot of heat in the earth, molten core, whatever. Radioactivity produces heat. When it's out in the open, the heat dissipates. When it's in the earth, and it's made very, very quickly, guess what happens? Rocks melt. And so deep in the earth today, there is heat, a lot of it.
Were there dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden?
Pardon?
I said, were there dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden?
We're going to get to that. Not dinosaurs, but the precursors of dinosaurs.
Okay.
What are we talking about tonight? A lot of that's in this video, which will be available tomorrow night, or it's on the website. You can go and just look at it there, www.halos.com. The Grand Canyon, and then we don't have a lot of time, and we want to get to the dinosaurs, David. What do you say about the Grand Canyon?
Well, anybody that's been to the Grand Canyon has struck by the flat pancake layering of each individual layer. You see the coconino sandstone there kind of stands out. But in an evolutionary model, you would expect there to be a lot of erosion and infilling during the millions of years that it took for each successive layer to be deposited on top of the other. But instead, you see very crisp lines of sediment, one right after the other, very uniform. And the reason why is very simple, because those layers of rock were laid down very rapidly at the time of the worldwide flood. And then they were cut through just as rapidly with some of the giant tidal waves that occurred after the flood. So there's absolutely no question that the Grand Canyon is one of the greatest evidences that we have of a worldwide flood. There's no way that you can explain the flat, very precise layering that you see there in the Grand Canyon on the basis of an evolutionary model of the Earth. It can't happen. So the sedimentary rocks there are young rocks. They're actually date from the time of the flood. And you have, of course, at the very base of the Grand Canyon, the non-fossiliferous rocks, the igneous rocks, which, of course, we're saying form the foundations of the continents.
All right, David, very quickly, tell us, you know all about this particular... The audience needs to understand very quickly what they're looking at here.
Well, very quickly, this is a slide that shows present-day oil formation in the Gulf of California, the Guaymas Basin. It illustrates the fact that some of the oil deposits that we see today in the earth, in the Middle East and elsewhere, those oil deposits actually could have formed very rapidly. The conditions that are required to make not only oil, but coal and all these things which geologists have thought take literally hundreds of thousands of years to form, can actually form rapidly. And if you look at the video, Young Age of the Earth, you can see us actually detail out exactly how that occurs. But it's true that the coalification process of just plain wood can actually happen just in a few weeks. And we show how that happens in the video. The present day oil formation here shows that oil can actually form under the right conditions rapidly. It makes sense then that if you have the worldwide flood occurring with all the heat generated, with the volcanic activity generated, you have perfect conditions for a rapid formation of the vast oil reserves, which we see, or which we don't really see, but we know that they exist because the oil companies mine them and, of course, use them to produce the petroleum products which we use so often today.
So we want to understand that indeed oil and coal are actually originate with under heat and pressure and so forth of the organic material, trees, plants, and everything that were fish and everything that were buried in the earth at the time of the flood. Then we go to the time over there in Utah when you and I were discussing. You were telling us about the rapid formation of the coalified wood there and some of the places in Utah and the experiment that we did in the laboratory showing that indeed you can take a piece of wood, as David was saying, and under the right conditions you can take it a long way toward the road of being coal in just a few weeks. As again in the video, Young Age of the Earth. Here I am down in the coal mine there in Price, Utah. David had gone there earlier and scouted out everything and got it ready for me to go down. And there is a dinosaur track in the roof of the coal mine. David, tell us.
Yeah, I recommend anybody that wants to see evidence of dinosaurs, go to Dinosaur National Monument. Go to Price, Utah. Ask to see the coal mines which actually contain these dinosaur tracks in the roofs of these coal mines. I mean, they're all over the place. I walked in there myself. I saw these. They're all over the place. Dinosaurs did exist. I believe they existed prior to the flood. I don't necessarily think that they were preserved in the ark at the time of the flood. Now, there's varying opinions on that. I realize that. And I respect the people that believe that dinosaurs still roam around on the earth today somewhere, but we don't believe that ourselves. We believe the dinosaurs perished at the time of the flood. If you go to Dinosaur National Monument in Vernal, Utah, you can actually see these dinosaurs had a very catastrophic ending to their lives. Some of them were ripped apart by what I feel like were violent, ferocious actions of the floodwaters that were actually operative at the time of their death. It's very impressive to see that. And they weren't walking around when they were making these tracks. They were running around looking for higher ground. As each wave of sediment came in, washed over them, they were tromping along on this, making new tracks. The new sediment would come in, perfectly preserving these dinosaur tracks until thousands of years later when they're uncovered by the mining companies there in Price, Utah. So there's no question about the fact that dinosaurs existed. The only question is there's differing opinions on how long ago they existed. And I would like to say that dinosaurs existed very recently. Recently, in fact, if you look at the video, Young Age of the Earth, you can actually see we photograph a dinosaur track in relation to a coalified log. That coalified log is something which is relatively recent. It dates the lives of the dinosaurs with the time of the flood. And I think that there's good evidence to show that the dinosaurs did exist with the antediluvians. What are antediluvians?
Several thousand years ago. They were antediluvians. But you asked the question earlier, of course, what about where did the dinosaurs come from? We want to put our viewpoint in here, and that is that the original kinds which God created in the creation week, he said all things were good, 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 and perfect. The dinosaurs, in my opinion, David's opinion, were not good and perfect. They were terrible creatures, very rapacious. They're out there tearing people. People lived at the same time, and other dinosaurs and other things apart. We believe there was genetic manipulation occurring in pre-flood days that rapidly took the original Genesis kinds and produced these dinosaurs. That's what we're believing. In fact, the Bible tells us there was a giant intellect that came, was thrown to this earth, and he basically had in his mind something to destroy God's creation and to pervert the original creation. And so we believe that genetic engineering occurred relatively soon after the fall of man. And so over the 1,000 years or so before the flood, the dinosaurs were beginning to proliferate. But indeed, we believe that indeed God, foreseeing that they were going to tear the world apart if they got into the ark and came here today, or later, of course, he did not allow them. Remember, the Bible says that the uncleans were not taken into the ark except by pairs, and the cleans were taken in by sevens. So there was a discrimination. We believe that the dinosaur original, whatever it was not taken into the ark, and that process God has not allowed that process to at least continue at the present time. There's some things, and so David, we have then the dinosaurs supposedly in all these different geological epochs, so to speak, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Eocene. In papers we don't have time to discuss with you tonight. We've had coalified wood specimens from all these areas, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Eocene, and just like with the primordial polonium halos, we found other evidence to show that indeed all these presumed geological eras, so different by 80 million, 110 million, and so forth, 200 million, they're all the same. They're all just buried there together in deposits at the time of the worldwide flood several thousand years ago. The ancient Earth evolutionary time scale, the granites that supposedly are going to go from 150 million years to 300 million years to 4 billion years and so forth, it all has collapsed because the isotope ratios, you see, are different. There was something going on non-uniform even throughout the Earth itself that caused different isotope ratios, and the evolutionists have interpreted those ratios to give you, quote, different ages for the foundation rocks. And then the collapse of evolutionary time, the simultaneous creation of Earth's foundation rocks just several thousand years ago. You go from the granite there in Yosemites and the Sierras to the basement rocks of the Grand Canyon and to Japan and Europe, Russia, and around the world in Canada. They're all the same. It's all part of the same creation. And we're saying basically the Lord left his fingerprints in the rocks, the foundation rocks that he created, to show us all tonight, to affirm to us that indeed by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done, and he commanded, and it was, and it did stand fast. So with that, David, you want to end for us?
Exodus 20, verse 11. Fourth commandment, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
That's our conclusion. We believe it's biblical and it's scientific. And we thank you so much for the opportunity of being with you this evening.